Hello and welcome. My name is Susan Gunn and I am the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. My colleague Dan Moriarty and I are coming to you today from our respective homes in Washington, D.C. And even while working from home during a pandemic, we from the Office for Global Concerns continue to represent the three entities of the Maryknoll mission. That's the Maryknoll Sisters, the Fathers and Brothers, and the lay missioners. And we work closely with the Maryknoll affiliates. Our job is to bring you the Maryknoll mission experience and bring that to important debates on public policy at the UN and Capitol Hill, the World Bank, the IMF, and the corporate world. And always our mission is to promote peace, social justice, and integrity of creation. And we do this through education, advocacy, and action. Just in recent weeks, Dan and I have written letters to and joined virtual meetings with members of Congress. We've led public witness and marches on the streets of Washington. And today we offer some education, this time about the use of sanctions in US foreign policy. I'm so excited to have Dan present today because he is the leading thinker on sanctions for Maryknoll. Dan's many years on mission with Maryknoll in Bolivia, his education in international peace studies from the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and now his work with the office in Washington as our Sustainable Pathways to Peace coordinator. All of that makes Dan just the right person to strengthen the voice of the Catholic community in the debate on sanctions. And while Dan talks to us, I want to invite everyone on Zoom to type questions in the Q&A and on YouTube to type your questions in the chat box. And so with that, I turn it over to you, Dan.
All right, thank you. I'm going to start with a slideshow presentation. So let me share my screen here and we'll start that. All right. Okay, today we will be looking at economic sanctions. Are these a nonviolent tool in our diplomatic toolbox, or are they a lethal weapon comparable to other weapons of war? For any of the issues covered in this series, we encourage you to visit our website, maryknollogc.org. Go to the election briefs page to find two-page written briefs on each of these issues and all kinds of great resources for further reading. So please check that out when we're done. Here and throughout this series, we've followed the see, judge, and act method of social analysis. The Church uses this around the world for understanding current events and how to respond to them as people of faith. So we start with the see step here, looking at what economic sanctions are and how they work in the world. What do we mean then when we talk about economic sanctions? It's complicated. They're a very diverse tool and they take all kinds of forms. Thinking about sanctions in the news, we may be most familiar with broad-based sanctions aimed at whole countries, but the targets of sanctions may be individuals. They may be drug traffickers or a terrorist cell or corrupt individuals within a foreign government whose accounts are frozen, or they may be trade tariffs or embargoes aimed at an entire country. And the way they're enforced is complicated as well. Depending on the type of sanctions, they may just limit our own government's dealings with the target, or what kind of business US-based firms or individuals can do with the targeted entity. Or they may involve secondary sanctions, which are consequences for foreign parties that do business with those entities. Now, the idea of using economic sanctions as a part of statecraft has been around actually for thousands of years, but we've honed it in specific ways in recent decades. It is generally it's a coercive economic means of influencing behavior, but we're going to explore some questions about what that actually looks like in the real world. Do we use them as a blunt weapon that hurts all kinds of people or as a precision tool? Are they really effective and when? And ultimately, are these sanctions used as a nonviolent alternative to military means, or are they also a kind of a violent weapon? And again, it depends on how we use them. In modern times and in the popular imagination, a lot of people really became aware of economic sanctions in the 1980s when they were employed against apartheid in South Africa. Now, the sanctions in South Africa were pretty popular, partly because they were effective. They ended apartheid, and also because they had come about because of popular demand of social movements around the world. Soon thereafter, though, we had these US-led UN sanctions in Iraq. And this is the first time we start to hear about the devastating human impact on civilians and about children dying as a direct result of the sanctions. There are major debates over statistics and what the ultimate humanitarian impact of the sanctions was. A UN study at the time claimed 500,000 children under 5 years old had died as a result of the sanctions. Later studies suggested 250,000 children. One controversial study claimed that while the sanctions caused terrible suffering, the death toll was nowhere near as large. Nonviolent activists on the ground, though, like Kathy Kelly with Voices for Creative Nonviolence, that's her picture with Iraqi children in the bottom left photo. In a powerful act of civil disobedience, she brought food and medicine into Iraq on dozens of occasions during this time and reported seeing widespread death, illness, and hunger as a result of the sanctions. Furthermore, whatever the actual death toll, the U.S. assumed the worst and continued the sanctions anyway. In an interview on 60 Minutes, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked if the death of 500,000 Iraqi children was a price worth paying to keep Saddam Hussein from developing weapons. Albright did not question that figure and famously answered, "We think it's worth it." What we bought for that assumed price of 500,000 dead children is also debatable. On the one hand, we now know it could be argued that the sanctions were effective in keeping Saddam from developing weapons. But not only did this success come at the cost of unfathomable death and destruction, it also failed to achieve the ultimate goal of peace. There were no weapons of mass destruction, but the U.S. invaded Iraq anyway and remains at war there 17 years later. So let's look at how exactly sanctions end up hurting civilians. Generally, this happens when sanctions are overly broad or overly complex in how they're structured. They hurt civilians indirectly, but in very real ways. A helpful example today is the so-called maximum pressure sanctions the U.S. has imposed on Iran. Legally, the healthcare sector and all medical goods are exempt from these and all U.S. imposed sanctions around the world. But Iran is a modern, sophisticated society. They import medicines as well as some ingredients for drugs they produce themselves. They import medical equipment and supplies. And individual patients pay for drugs and care. And all of this activity is dependent upon the same financial institutions, banks, and currency exchanges that are targeted by the sanctions. So that even though the healthcare industry is technically exempt, the sanctions make it impossible for the Iranian healthcare system to function. Of course, the devastation this causes is multiplied during a crisis such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. It's also important to understand what makes sanctions effective or not. We're concerned primarily with the moral and ethical implications of imposing sanctions, and effectiveness is one part of that calculus. Sanctions are often used with the objective of protecting lives by stopping the development of nuclear weapons or other violent behavior. Now, certain costs, like the death of children, are always unacceptable, but we may decide that some degree of more limited human suffering is an acceptable cost given our aims. In making that kind of tough ethical decision, one important factor is effectiveness, because no cost is worth it if sanctions are unlikely to succeed in achieving their aims. There have been myriad studies on what makes sanctions effective. Generally, we know what works and what doesn't. We know that sanctions are not effective when they're too broad, like maximum pressure campaigns aimed at crippling a country's entire economy, or too complex with multiple secondary effects. Sanctions cannot be solely punitive, and they're not a strategy unto themselves. They don't work when they're employed alone without accompanying diplomatic efforts. Using sanctions just to punish the target rather than negotiate the kind of positive steps they can take to have sanctions lifted is bound to fail. Sanctions also don't work when they are applied unilaterally. To be effective, they require an international coalition, united in both applying pressure through the sanctions and engaging in diplomatic negotiations to end them. Also, sanctions aimed at regime change do not work. For the regime in question, regime change is always going to be more unacceptable than the sanctions themselves, so it's a non-starter. The longer sanctions are left in place, the less effective they are. Ask Cuba. And finally, to work, sanctions must actually create the kind of economic hardship they were designed to impose. So going back to the example of Iran, while U.S. sanctions there are hurting civilians, the Iranian government really isn't hurting because it receives help from other countries like Russia. So we see again that unilateral sanctions also are not effective. And when sanctions are ineffective, they not only fail to achieve their objectives, but they create new problems. Failed sanctions in one case weaken the ability of other sanctions to work elsewhere. And when we impose sanctions that cause suffering for civilians, it hurts our own credibility and standing in the world. I mentioned that sanctions are ineffective when they're too complex, and one problem here is secondary sanctions. These are the consequences that a sanction regime imposes on other parties. It could be U.S. businesses or international aid and development organizations, or our allies around the world even, who are involved directly or indirectly in doing business with the target. So punishing these third parties creates tensions that lead to new problems. In this way, sanctions can destabilize regional alliances. They can hurt our allies or alienate us from them, weakening our ability to negotiate with other countries. And this, in turn, can empower our adversaries, like in the case of Russia. Their standing in Iran and throughout the Middle East has arguably been strengthened by U.S. sanctions. We also know that sanctions are typically effective when they meet certain conditions. They must be established with clear objectives, clear to us and clear to the targeted party. They must be employed as part of a larger carrot and stick approach where we punish bad behavior, but we also reward positive behavior. This means giving the target a timeline and a set of clear, realistic steps they can take in order for sanctions to be lifted. To move the target toward these steps, it's important that sanctions be employed by a multilateral coalition. Different countries with different kinds of power and relationships in the region must all be engaged in negotiating the path forward. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, realistic objectives are key. A powerful, fairly recent example of the effective use of sanctions is the efforts that led to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, more commonly called the Iran nuclear deal. All of the ingredients I've mentioned here were employed together and resulted in that groundbreaking agreement with a built-in path forward for further negotiations. Unfortunately, in 2017, the Trump administration pulled out of that agreement, choosing instead to impose the unilateral and devastating sanctions we have today, the so-called maximum pressure campaign. It's important to remember here that in order for sanctions to be ethical, they must be effective or at least have a reasonable likelihood of success. But that's not the same thing as saying that all effective sanctions are ethical sanctions. Some sanctions may be effective in terms of achieving their stated objectives, but still unethical if they succeed by exacting an unacceptable human cost. During the last 3 years, the U.S. has increasingly imposed sanctions as a first resort, and the sanctions that they've imposed have been neither effective nor ethical. Maryknollers living and working in a number of countries in the world have communicated with our office about the terrible suffering they've witnessed as a result of U.S.-imposed sanctions. This compels us to rethink how do we pursue human security and seek peace through compassion and bridge building rather than punishment. A beautiful example of this is Maryknoll Father Jerry Hammond in Korea. Father Hammond has made over 70 humanitarian trips to North Korea, spending time with the people and bringing medical help to TB patients there, together with the Eugene Bell Foundation. He understands all too well the kind of oppressive system in place in the North, as well as the nuclear threat and the tensions that exist between the North and the South where he lives. He sees the work he does there as paving the way for peace on the peninsula. He tells us, ordinary people are suffering a lot because of sanctions. They're tightening their belts. They need rice. We act as a bridge between the two Koreas, so we try to create a climate of trust that can facilitate the work of those who will come after us. This kind of compassion builds trust and goodwill, laying the groundwork for dialogue that leads to peace. How many of our political leaders understand this? Well, let's look at what kind of sanctions the U.S. has in place today. According to OFAC, which is the Treasury Department's office that oversees U.S. imposed sanctions, we are currently targeting over 30 entities around the world with sanctions. And the Department of State is also involved in overseeing over 20 of these programs. And that runs the whole gamut of different types of sanctions. So the dozens of sanctions programs the U.S. currently has in place target all kinds of entities, from individuals to whole countries. But it's the whole countries that we're most concerned about because that's where civilians are impacted. And so that includes Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and Syria. And those are the sanctions regimes that we've been following most closely. In the written brief on our website, you can find links to some of the letters and petitions that we've put out urging leaders to lift some of these most damaging sanctions. I've mentioned that the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating the suffering of civilian populations impacted by U.S. sanctions. To that point, in March, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, called for a global ceasefire to allow warring countries to care for their citizens in the midst of the pandemic. In that same address, he also called for debt relief and for the lifting or relaxing of sanctions, which he said inhibited the ability of targeted countries to meet the needs of their people who were suffering from the COVID-19 virus. So there have been efforts in the UN Security Council since then to pass a resolution supporting the Secretary General's call. But the U.S. delegation had refused for a long time to allow such a resolution to be passed until just 2 weeks ago on July 2nd. Much of the Trump administration's resistance was to any perceived support for the work of the World Health Organization, which you may have read about in the news. But actually, the final point of contention was over sanctions. And the U.S. only finally agreed to the resolution when it was made clear that the Security Council supports Guterres' call for a ceasefire, but not for the lifting of sanctions. So the devastating U.S. sanctions in Iran and Venezuela and elsewhere remain in place today, even as the pandemic rages on. So again, if you go to the written brief on our website, you can see some of the statements and letters that we've signed on to asking the U.S. government to lift sanctions in North Korea and the Middle East and elsewhere during the coronavirus pandemic. So now we are firmly in the judge section of our webinar. Here we ask ourselves, how does our faith inform the way we think about economic sanctions? We've established that sanctions can pose a threat to human life, and they therefore threaten a form of violence. And so the ethics around economic sanctions must necessarily draw from the ethics around warfare and other forms of violence. That means that some of the Catholic values we should be considering here are those of gospel nonviolence and of just peace. Well, however we think about sanctions, we should be seeking to respect the sanctity of life, always to protect the vulnerable. We should be seeking diplomatic and other processes that advance the cause of reconciliation, dialogue between the U.S. and our adversaries, and ultimately that build sustainable peace between countries and peoples. Unfortunately, too often, and especially in recent years under the Trump administration, we've seen the increased use of sanctions that fail these criteria. These are sanctions that violate Catholic gospel values. Gospel nonviolence demands of us what Pope Francis likes to refer to as integral disarmament. So this disarmament includes the arms of weaponized economic tools like sanctions, but it also includes an internal spiritual kind of a disarmament that allows us to turn toward other ways of thinking about security, like that modeled by Father Hammond, where he seeks to build trust between peoples in conflict, which will allow us to transform those conflicts into sustainable peace. If we do resort to using sanctions, the official teaching and social doctrine of the Church, and you can find it on our website, is clear that sanctions must only be used with great discernment and must be subjected to strict legal and ethical criteria. And we've established what some of those criteria are for sanctions to be used strategically and also ethically, especially without harming civilians. As we think about the ethics of employing sanctions, we have to remember all the complicated secondary effects that sanctions can have. So that, like in the case of Iran that I described, even when civilians or the medical healthcare industry are not the target of the sanctions, they are often the ones to suffer. In this sense, we need to think about sanctions the same way we'd think about any indiscriminate weapon that hurts civilians, whether or not they are the target of the attack. Finally, in terms of church teaching, I mentioned the Secretary General of the United Nations calling for a lifting of sanctions during the COVID pandemic. The Pope echoed that call. So at Easter, his Easter Mass in his Ubi et Orbi address to Rome and to the world, Pope Francis echoed the call and supported the call for a global ceasefire and debt relief. And he also called for the lifting or relaxing of sanctions to allow countries to care for their people during the pandemic. This brings us to the third and final step in our three-part see, judge, and act process here, action. How does this new understanding of sanctions compel us to act as people of faith and as U.S. citizens, especially in this election year? And the first action I ask you to take is to pray and join your prayers with those of Pope Francis in his Easter address when he prays, God, in light of the present circumstances, may international sanctions be relaxed, since these make it difficult for countries on which they've been imposed to provide adequate support to their citizens. God, hear our prayer. Now, again, I realize this is a really complicated topic and we've just scratched the surface today. So once again, I encourage you to go to our website and read up. I think we've got some really good resources there for you to continue your research into understanding this complicated and potentially dangerous tool. Finally, get involved in the democratic process. Call the campaign offices for your candidates for Congress and for the presidency. Let them know how important this issue is for you. Find out where they stand and challenge them to go on the record with commitments to taking the kind of positions we've discussed. Church doctrine demands deep discernment before imposing sanctions, and it demands similar discernment from us as voters in this most powerful country in the world, a country responsible for so many brutal sanctions in place today. So when we consider political candidates, we must consider which candidate is most likely to employ sanctions sparingly in ways that are strategic and nonviolent. We should ask ourselves, is this candidate capable of understanding these criteria, of building international alliances and fostering multilateral dialogue between allies and adversaries? Will this candidate use sanctions in a way that is not simply punitive, but employs both carrots and sticks, encouraging realistic, positive behavior? Will this candidate take care not to harm civilians? Ask yourself, too, is this a candidate who will listen to the voices of the most vulnerable, both the citizens of countries impacted by our sanctions and organizations like Maryknoll, who accompany those communities and bring their voices to the halls of power in Washington? Might this candidate consider lifting sanctions during this pandemic to allow countries to provide the health care and other services that their people so desperately need? Discern all of this and then vote. Vote for strategic gospel nonviolence and vote for just, sustainable peace. Vote in November. Vote, vote, vote. Thank you. And vote.
Thank you so much, Dan. So clearly, sanctions, extremely complex, overused, used by the United States again and again, and so much more so in recent years. So you've raised a lot of compelling points, particularly about our church teaching and that we, not only as Catholics, but as voters, our responsibilities here. So looking at the questions that are coming in, you mentioned the use of sanctions in South Africa as effective, but you also said that sanctions aimed at regime change have not worked. So which is it? Were those in South Africa aimed at regime change, and how was it that they were effective?
That's a really good question. Thanks. Partly, I think it could be considered sort of the exception that proves the rule, but I think it's important to think about what we mean by regime change and how that came about in South Africa. So first of all, part of what we talk about there is the apartheid regime. And so that's different than toppling a government exactly. It's changing a system that was excluding most South Africans and oppressing them in all kinds of violent ways. So I think that was brought about, and then the government changed because that meant that suddenly South Africans were able to vote. Black South Africans were able to vote, and so they elected a new government. But the regime there accepted the change to apartheid, and that was really the goal of that set of sanctions. So, and that happened through cooperation with people in the country who were working with solidarity movements around the world that were promoting those sanctions.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great piece of history that we should find some confidence there from that experience. And now, could you say more about the positive example of the Iran nuclear deal and just the use of sanctions in Iran leading up to that, and how diplomatic efforts there led to the nuclear deal?
Yeah, that's also a good question. Because I think one thing that's complicated there, I mentioned that all the ways that sanctions can be effective, and Iran is a good example of them being effective, but also the difference between effective sanctions and ethical sanctions. I would not hold up the sanctions that led to the Iran nuclear deal as positive in the sense of being ethical, because they were still these comprehensive kinds of sanctions that aim at a whole country and hurt their economy in ways that really cause suffering to ordinary citizens. And so I would not defend that. But I do think that the process that went along with that is a great example of the kind of diplomacy we're talking about. So when we talk about imposing sanctions, if we're going to use them at all, but more generally, achieving our aims through diplomacy, through multilateral relationships, through dialogue, through having a plan, making it clear on a timeline, and giving positive steps that a country can take in order to have sanctions lifted, or any other measures that we're using to apply pressure. That was all done in a very positive way, and the end result, the nuclear deal, was excellent. It didn't do everything, but it had built-in steps for further negotiations. So that's how diplomacy works. Eventually you achieve even more because it set up this process for dialogue. So I think it's a great example for looking at diplomacy, but I still think the sanctions were problematic. Probably the best sanctions to be looking at in terms of sanctions working and being ethical would be much more limited sanctions. Really, I didn't talk as much about those, but if you look at the list of sanctions on the OFAC site at the Department of State of the Treasury, you'll see all the sanctions that are aimed at a terrorist cell or individuals, freezing accounts and things that aren't aimed at whole countries in this comprehensive way that hurts civilians.
Right. It's that list of whole country sanctions that are just unethical. And have they even ever proven that they achieve their goals? So clearly, in reality, sanctions seem to maintain conflicts and pave the way for more war rather than averting them and hurt large swaths of the civilian population. So it's up to us to keep pointing out the human costs. So thank you, and to keep calling for more effective alternatives in diplomacy and in our nation's foreign policy. So that brings me to your great call to vote. Right, that's why we're here today, to participate in the election. So thank you. That's all we have time for today. And I want to say a big thank you to Dan for this excellent presentation, and to everyone for joining us. I hope this webinar and the two-pager on our website about sanctions is helpful to you, and that you can share it with your friends and family and tell them to go vote after reading it. I want to put a plug in there for our next webinar in this series, and that's on August 18th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And the focus will be on justice for immigrants in U.S. policy. The registration for that webinar is right where Dan said. You go to our website, www.maryknollogc.org, and then right in the center of the screen, you click on the Election Briefs project, and you'll see the 8 topics. You'll find the recording to this webinar, and also registration for the next one, Justice for Immigrants in U.S. Policy, August 18th. So I hope you all can join us then. And until then, thank you, Dan. Peace to you all, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.